Hello, true creatives, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with me today Dr. Angus Fletcher from Ohio State University. Dr. Fletcher has been doing some very interesting work recently about new ways of enhancing people's creativity and how this is very different from some of the more computational ways that we use to enhance creativity in people. Dr. Fletcher, it's wonderful having you here today.
Nick, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joining you.
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. So for people who aren't aware of you and your work, could you just give us a very brief background as to where you got started and how you got to where you are now?
So my ultimate background is in neuroscience, and basically I'm just interested in all the parts of the brain that work non-logically, non-rationally, and those traditionally include things like emotion, but they also include things like narrative and creativity. And I'm currently at Ohio State's Project Narrative, which is the world's leading think tank for the study of story, and I'm myself known as a story scientist, which is basically applying neuroscience to how narrative works in the brain.
Now, what does this actually mean, narrative storytelling, as far as looking at how the brain's operating? What sort of work does that entail?
So the way we often think about the brain nowadays is as a kind of computer. So we think of it as a sense-making apparatus that takes on data through the eyes and other senses and then crunches that data to make logical decisions. But actually, a huge part of the way our brain evolved is to initiate action. And the brain can initiate action on the basis of very little or, in fact, no data whatsoever. Children can just spontaneously decide to do things on the basis of zero information. And that's because there are these motor regions in the brain that just can start us acting. And when you chain together actions, when one action leads to another, that's a narrative. That's a story. And so what I'm interested in and what my research focuses on is how the brain is able to chain together actions into plots and plans and strategies and all these other creative things that allow us not just to predict the future, but to make the future.
Now, you talked a bit about motor circuitry in the brain. As far as I understand this is mainly used for physical movement. Are you saying that some of the motor neurons or motor areas in the brain are also involved with taking in information and processing it, or creating a narrative? What exactly is happening there?
Yeah, what's happening there is actually our motor regions are responsible for most of our practical intelligence. So again, we're thought to think of intelligence nowadays usually in terms of IQ and data and reasoning and all these sorts of things that computers do. But actually, most of human intelligence is the ability to come up with a new plan, a new plot. When you get up in the morning, what am I going to do today? When you encounter a challenge or an obstacle, how am I going to overcome that? If you have a new idea for a business, how am I going to create that? That's all thinking in actions and plots and plans. And because that's all about action and motion, it all actually originates in the same kind of neural circuitry as our motor regions. It develops from the same parts of our brain that allow us to be athletic or to invent new kinds of dance and things like that. And that's all narrative. It manifests in storytelling, playwrights, novelists. And so that's what I study, but I study it not so much in the context of the arts, but in the context of the military or business and these other areas where planning and plotting and strategy have more obvious kind of real world consequences.
Now, as I mentioned, you and your team are looking at new ways to enhance people's creativity. So based on your research, what are you finding about either how creativity is working in a different way than maybe some of the previous research suggests, and how can we actually use that insight to become more creative ourselves?
So previous research into creativity emphasized this idea of the brain as a computer, as logical. And this started back in the 1940s and 1950s with the US Air Force, a guy called Colonel J.P. Guilford. And he came up with a technique that he called divergent production, which we now call divergent thinking, which is the basis of almost all training and creativity in modern workforces. And it involves techniques such as brainstorming. And it's basically mix and matching ideas from different semantic and symbolic sets in the human brain. And this is something that computers can do. And in fact, they do it much better than humans, because computers have a much greater memory and a much higher ability to be random. So they can come up with much more interesting mix and matching combinations. But as we've known for a long time, computers and AI are actually not more creative than humans. They can't do a lot of things that the human brain can creatively. And we also know that when humans are trained in divergent thinking, it doesn't actually really increase their ability to be creative very much. And so my team was kind of tasked with this problem. What is another way? What are other ways that creativity can come from? Where else can it come from? And how can we use that? And so I started out working with business schools like the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business and the US Army's Command and General Staff College to develop a new set of techniques that are non-logical, that are non-rational, that are things that computers can't do, but that are based in those narrative circuits that you and I were talking about earlier.
So can you give us an example of that? How does non-rational, non-logical structure result in something creative?
Well, the simplest example is something known as counterfactual thinking. And so counterfactual thinking just involves changing one detail of the world and then imagining forward to what would happen if that change was made. So if you imagine, for example, that humans could no longer see the color blue, what would happen then? What would happen if all of a sudden humans could no longer see the color blue? What changes would have to come? What changes would be precipitated? And then what opportunities would emerge? Would we have to develop new kinds of detection technology for identifying blues and all these kinds of things? So that's known as counterfactual thinking, and you can do that endlessly. Children do it naturally, but as adults, we're encouraged not to do it. And actually, the more, one of the things we've noticed, and this is not our research, this is other people's research, the more time people stay in school, and particularly the more time they train as engineers and computer scientists, the less effective they get at counterfactual thinking and some of the associated techniques, because they're encouraged to be rational and not think sort of in those kinds of quirky, apparently unusual situations. So counterfactual thinking is a kind of basic one. Perspective shifting is another technique we use. Identifying exceptional information is something we work a lot with on the military. So there's a lot of these different techniques.
I mean, the way you just described it, what would be the impact of a situation like if you couldn't see the color blue? That is, as far as I'm aware, the type of question that has been used for divergent thinking tests in the past, though. So these types of open-ended questions where there's multiple right answers, I don't think it necessarily means that it's not using similar brain circuitry or outputs that are created from traditional divergent thinking tests, though.
Okay, well, so you're absolutely right. Yeah, that sort of simple example, which is why I used it, is one of the ones that goes back to some of the early testing, not so much training, I would say. That's something that's used in testing, but it's not something that actually involves logical circuits. I mean, this is the kind of key thing. This is why computers can't engage in counterfactual thinking. They can only engage in modeling and kind of playing through with different data sets. So, but I mean, I'll give you a couple other simple examples to kind of maybe start to illustrate the point better. One of the things that we do is we work to identify what the Army likes to call exceptional information. And so exceptional information is identifying what makes something different or unusual in a space, something that it does not have in common with other elements around it. And this is the opposite of how generalization works. Generalization, which is kind of classic way that the logic works, is to identify what things have similarly. It's to say, you know, when you see an outlier or anomaly, how do we regress it back to a mean? And what we do in exceptional information is we say, no, actually, we're going to focus on what's unique about something. And we're then going to imagine, what if that one unique thing becomes everything? What if that one unusual customer you have who's making this apparently weird demand turns out to be the customer of the future? What if this one problem that you see showing up in your network isn't actually a glitch? What if that's actually going to happen all the time? And, you know, a very simple example of this, of course, is the first instance of the coronavirus. You know, I mean, everyone thought, well, that's odd, that's weird. And then all of a sudden it's everywhere. And, you know, the more you can start to become attuned to what makes something different or unusual, the more your brain starts to become aware of emergent opportunities and threats in the space that break from the kind of statistical norm that has been established by past practice.
So having listened to you, what's starting to go sort of through my head is Divergent thinking is very good at generating a very large number of somewhat surface level ideas. So iterations or associations between ideas to spark something that's a multiple of what happened previously, but they're not necessarily very detailed. And the examples that you gave, and going back to the example of children playing and creating a narrative or planning out forward, that involves taking one of these possible ideas and taking it several steps further. So either you create a narrative where the story leads on from the first idea to essentially expanding it through time forward, or some of the logical examples you mentioned where you have one scenario where you might think of, okay, these are some surface level divergent ideas, but what's actually the implication? How do we need to respond to it? That gets the sort of the next level of detail down on each. Am I a bit on the right track? Am I completely off track? Sort of what's the thought process there?
No, that's wonderful. That's brilliant. And obviously you should be explaining this technique instead of me, because that's exactly correct. Is the more kind of specific and particular you can make something, the more likely it is to kind of engage these creative circuits. And also, to your point, the more you can push the experiment into the future. I mean, I just got off the phone with a large industrial company that makes engines for airplanes. And what they were basically saying is you know, we have this problem, and all engineers have this problem, is the problem of optimization. And what we're doing is we're getting smaller and smaller incremental improvements in something, but we're not radically redesigning what the technology is. And what happens is the more you can actually make a kind of simple foundational fundamental shift and then start to play that forward aggressively into the future, you then start to ask yourself questions like, well, why do we need airplane engines at all? What is it the airplane engine was designed to do? Is there some other technology that could do that? Do we even need a technology that does this at all? And you start to be able to ask those questions that become bigger and more profound, and you start to push them aggressively into the future. And when you maintain a level of generality about that, it's not very helpful. But to your point, when you can be incredibly specific about those alternate futures, you start to very quickly start to see, oh, here's an alternate technology that would work instead. And you know, the point in these exercises is not to predict the future. I don't think there's any way to know that. But the point is to encourage your brain to be flexible so that when the future does arrive, you have the ability to adapt more rapidly to it while everyone else is either still panicking or going back into the toolbox to try to use something that they've already used before.
I mean, it's interesting you used an example there of airplane engineers who are looking for a situation to go beyond just iterative or incremental improvement. And earlier on, you said, especially students or engineers who've been trained to think a certain way for quite a long time, find this exercise specifically difficult. So what's been your experience either with this set of engineers or another group that you've actually taken through a set of exercises? What might these exercises look like, and what's it actually trying to improve?
So to your point about engineers, I work a lot with engineers now for two reasons. First of all, engineers are deeply interested in being creative because it's a kind of cornerstone of engineering that you want to innovate. You want to come up with something very new. But we just know that the more training that people receive in engineering, the less creative they get. And that's not something that I've documented. There's a lot of really good research on there that
the curse of knowledge,
highlights
the Einstellung effect, as it's also known.
Yeah, it's thought of as the curse of knowledge, but really it's the curse of a particular method. I mean, it's the curse of trying to solve problems efficiently. The more you're trying to solve problems efficiently, the more you're limiting yourself to answers that you can predict will work. And immediately when you can predict an answer will work, it's not that creative. Because the test of a true creative idea is that you actually have to test it to know if it's going to work. If you can predict an idea in advance and its kind of functional range, it's staying within observed rules and norms. So it's not that creative. So you really want to start pushing your engineering team to the moment that they're coming up with designs that they don't know if they will work. And when you start seeing deep uncertainty among highly talented people about whether a design will work, you're like, okay, now we're in a good space. Because then what you want to do is you want to get a lot of those ideas that they're very, very uncertain about, but that because they're very expert, you know, there's a lot of knowledge behind those ideas. And then you want to say, okay, how can we start designing fast prototypes to see if they'll work? And there's lots of classic examples of this in the history of, for example, airplane technology. I mean, you know, when they came up with the stealth bomber, or, you know, the idea that basically a plane could just be a single wing. Instead of a plane having two wings, let's just make a plane a wing. Could that work? Everyone's like, I don't have the slightest idea if it could work. And so what ends up happening is you want to start to push teams into that zone of radical uncertainty where they start saying, we have to try it. There's no way to know in advance. And that getting to that zone involves these techniques we've been talking about, and also increasing a little bit of an appetite for risk and being willing to go outside of answers that immediately are gonna grok it.
I mean, you mentioned at the beginning that you've got a background in neuroscience. I'm not sure if many of your colleagues do as well. One of the things I've been finding more and more fascinating over the last couple of years is understanding the reasons why people become less creative. And it's because our brain is evolved to be not only a pattern recognition machine, but the most efficient user of energy as possible. And so the more it sees something work, the more those brain networks and synapses wire together. Not only the synapses becoming more efficient, but the neurons themselves becoming more efficient through myelination. So you can't blame biology for wanting to be as efficient and effective as possible. I'm just interested to see you talking about these motor regions at the beginning. Have you found any neuroscience sort of insights from your research about what's happening in the brain, either while there are these moments of high creativity and what might be causing those brains to become less creative, or is that a little bit outside of your specialty?
No, I mean, the basis of the basis of this research is because I was brought in to do a bunch of work in AI, and I started realizing the computers weren't able to do a lot of the stuff that I thought they should be able to do. And so I kind of went back to basics in terms of how the human brain works and the kind of mechanisms in there, and started identifying why computers were having a hard time mimicking those mechanisms. And so this is really the kind of actually the sweet spot. To your point about the human brain having evolved to be a pattern finder, that's true of half the human brain. So our visual cortex and the logical sections, those identify patterns very powerfully, but other parts of our brain are actually not interested in patterns at all in that way, at least not in terms of patterns. They're introduced in reproducible behaviors, which is a little bit different, and there's a tension there. And so actually a big part of increasing creativity, which you see, for example, in theater students or anyone who does improv, is actually just encouraging spontaneous movements, as opposed to kind of focusing on fixed, stable patterns, because a stable pattern exists permanently, outside of time, whereas movement is always dynamic and inherently kind of disruptive. To your point about what's going on in the brain, to speak about it generally without kind of getting too deep in the weeds of the mechanics, the main thing is that creativity is largely hindered by fears and hopes. And what we find is that when we ask people what they think is possible, what they think can happen, over 90% of what they identify as possible reflects one of their personal fears or hopes. So if you're afraid something's going to happen, if you're afraid the world's going to get wiped out by climate change, you're going to rate that as highly, highly likely. If you really want something to happen, you're also going to think that that's relatively likely. Of course, it turns out that, on average, less than 1% of the things that we hope and fear actually come true. And so what's happening there is our hopes and fears are radically constraining our sense of what is possible in the world. And anytime we're surprised, that's a moment where one of our hopes and fears didn't come true. That's something outside that box. And so a big thing we work on in terms of brains is kind of downplaying or kind of down regulating hopes and fears, and getting people into spaces where other kind of weaker emotions like curiosity can start to come to the fore. And this is something when we work with special forces, they actually have this exercise where they tell themselves that they're already dead. They go through this whole exercise where they convince themselves that they're dead. And once you're dead, you have no hopes, you have no fears, right? Because everything has already happened. And then this kind of opens up this kind of radical possibility for lateral movement where they can do things on the battlefield that they couldn't do otherwise. So I hope that answers the question a little bit. But I mean, that's one of the main things without going into the myelin and those kinds of things. Because, the main thing with creativity is it involves neuroplasticity. And so anything in general which encourages plasticity is going to encourage creativity just kind of physiologically.
And speaking of physiologically as well, I'm fascinated to hear about your insights between this link of movement and encouraging the brain to think in different ways. It's something that I hadn't gone into too much detail in my thinking previously, but I had done a lot of improv, and that does involve a lot of spontaneous movement. So are you saying that if you want to encourage yourself or your team members to think in unexpected ways, maybe a trigger might be to let your body lead the way by making them do something in a movement that they're not previously used to doing, and then that might have a positive effect?
I mean, that's brilliant and completely correct. I mean, of course, we all know that when you get up and start moving around, you have better ideas. And when you're sitting in your chair, you have less good ideas. And there's all sorts of, more complicated explanations for it than just simply movement. But there's no question that movement and getting those parts of your brain firing, because what those parts of your brains are is what we technically call causal thinkers. They're thinking, oh, what is the cause of this? What is the effect of that? And the more you get into a kind of a cause and effect way of thinking, you're doing something known as reverse engineering, where you're working back from effects to causes and forwards from causes to effects, and you're kind of predicting and playing back. And that whole process is incredibly generative of practical ideas, not of theoretical ideas, because theoretical ideas are obviously, they exist in the zone of logic, but practical ideas, things that might actually work in practice. So absolutely, a little improv, a little moving around, a little dance, things that often people feel a little bit awkward about and don't like to do because they're getting you out of your comfort zone. And the moment that something's making you feel a little bit awkward and getting you out of your comfort zone, that's usually a pretty good sign that it's kind of opening you up to new possibilities. And so you kind of want to lean into that discomfort a little bit and try and get members of your team to engage in those ways.
It's really interesting. We're unfortunately coming up on time, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about one thing you touched on at the beginning, which is you trying to find an ability for computers and artificial intelligence to actually become better at some of these more creative, open-ended tasks. And there's been a lot of examples in the last couple of years. So in the last 5 years, there's been really a breakthrough in computers exhibiting what people might previously have called creative behavior. Things like AlphaGo coming up with creative moves in a game, and especially recently GPT-3 creating not just original text that people judge as being valuable and new, but being used for a multitude of different creative aspects like code generation or anything to do with text generation. But at the end of the day, it's always a human taking a list of possible outputs and saying, well, this 90% is useless, but these 10%, these are actually creative. So what's your view on how artificial intelligence is currently on the journey towards creativity? And will it always require a human at the end of the day to do that final judgment?
I don't think it'll always require a human at the end of the day to do that kind of final judgment. But what I do think, so my own background is largely working with GPT-3 and kind of similar systems. That's what I was brought in to work with. And so that's where my area of expertise is. And what I will say is that computers are already far better than humans at divergent thinking. And GPT-3 is already much better at humans at coming up with large kinds of random story possibility thingies. It's just its ability to come up with short bits of text that are more divergent than any human could come up with is undeniable. What they can't do, and I don't think they'll ever do, is they can't come up with plans or plots or strategies or these longer kind of narrative things. And I have a long research article where I've kind of proved this. I go through it logically and kind of prove it using Alan Turing's proof, actually, for why computers can't solve the halting problem, to explain why they are limited to one domain of creativity. So if anyone wants to read that, they can find that. But the main takeaway is that humans can generate a lot of random kind of pixels. They can generate billions and billions of artificial faces and cartoons, and anything that's semantic and symbolic, they can do. But they're never going to plan to take over the world because they can't engage in that linking together of causes one to the other. And that's why when you read GPT-3, the stories always start out as though they're very interesting, and then they very rapidly disintegrate and go nowhere because the computer isn't aware of what plot is or what narrative is. And so it can't sustain it because it has no idea. It can just keep putting together words that sound stylistically appropriate, and words added together do not create a story. They might create a poem, but not a story.
Taking it all the way back, they're not going to be good at this narrative of taking an idea and expanding it while still keeping it along a logical narrative. Interesting. Dr. Fletcher, it's been really wonderful speaking with you. If people want to find out more about you and your work, what's the best place they can go to find out more?
I have a fairly low-grade website, angusfletcher.co. And they can also look me up on LinkedIn and be one of my 6 or 7 followers.
Perfect. I'll make sure to get those links down in the description below. Dr. Fletcher, it's been wonderful speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
It's been a huge pleasure to talk to you, and of course, anytime.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they are backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.